5 versions of Enterprise's T'Pol in Star Trek explain. Jolene Blalock played Subcommander T'Pol in all 4 seasons of Star Trek Enterprise, but Jolene has also embodied a handful of other variants of her Vulcan science officer. Introduced in Enterprise's series premiere, Blalock had the unenviable task of developing a new Vulcan character in the shadow of Leonard Nimoy's Mr. Spock. Jolene rose to the challenge with a performance that honored Nimoy's legendary Vulcan, while also turning T'Pol into a singular Star Trek heroine who remains beloved 20 years after Star Trek Enterprise was canceled. Star Trek Enterprise was a controversial, for the time, prequel that established the first starship. Enterprise wasn't the Constitution-class vessel commanded by Captain Christopher Pike, Jeffrey Hunter, and Captain James T. Kirk, William Shatner. Instead, a century before Star Trek, the original series, the NX-01, led by Captain Jonathan Archer, Scott Bakula, was retconned as the first Enterprise to explore the galaxy. Enterprise's retcon included Subcommander T'Pol, who predated Spock as the first Vulcan to serve as science officer aboard the Enterprise. Yet other versions of T'Pol have also popped up on Enterprise and in the greater Star Trek franchise. T'Pol in Star Trek Enterprise. Subcommander T'Pol served aboard the NX-01 Enterprise in the dual role of science officer and first officer to Captain Archer. Although Star Trek Enterprise only aired for 4 seasons, Archer's Enterprise was in service for 10 years, from 2151 to 2161, with T'Pol part of the crew for the duration. Originally a short-term liaison representing the Vulcan Science Council, T'Pol grew disillusioned with the corrupt Vulcan government and eventually aligned herself with her Starfleet crewmates aboard Enterprise. T'Pol's experience, intelligence, and logic proved invaluable to the NX-01 Enterprise, especially in the tumultuous early portion of Captain Archer's voyages. It's logical to surmise that Enterprise would not have survived without T'Pol. However, T'Pol was often mired with storylines that victimized her or showcased Jolene Blalock's sex appeal, which the actress was critical of. Nonetheless, Enterprise's retcon means T'Pol canonically laid the groundwork for Vulcans in Starfleet, from Spock to LT. Tuvok, Tim Russ, on Star Trek Voyager. T'Pol's romantic relationship with Enterprise's chief engineer, Commander Trip Tucker, Connor Trenier, is arguably the lasting impression and legacy of the Vulcan. The mismatched duo became a fan-favorite odd couple, although Jolene Blalock was not in favor of T'Pol and Trip's love affair. Still, T'Pol emerged as both a Starfleet legend and a legend of equal magnitude to real-life Star Trek fans. Jolene Blalock's first performance as a variant of T'Pol was playing Tamir, T'Pol's second foremother, great-grandmother, in Star Trek Enterprise Season 2, Episode 2, Carbon Creek. Although Tamir was T'Pol's ancestor, Blalock portraying Tamir hints that the two Vulcans are physically similar, if not identical. T'Pol left Captain Archer and Trip the impression that her story was apocryphal, but Star Trek Enterprise showing Tamir's purse as T'Pol's heirloom indicates Carbon Creek happened as T'Pol described. T'Pol, portrayed by Jolene Blalock, was one of the central characters in Star Trek Enterprise, the prequel series that explored humanity's first steps into deep space in the 22nd century. As the science officer of the titular starship, T'Pol served as both a cultural bridge between humans and Vulcans, as well as a key member of Captain Jonathan Archer's crew. Throughout the series, several different versions of T'Pol were presented, ranging from alternate timelines to mirror universes that each shed new light on her character. Here are 5 versions of T'Pol in Star Trek Enterprise explained. 1. The standard timeline. T'Pol in the primary timeline of Star Trek Enterprise, T'Pol is a Vulcan who initially serves as an observer for the Vulcan High Command, assigned to the NX-01 Enterprise in its early days of exploration. Over time, she becomes a full-fledged officer aboard the ship, eventually holding the rank of commander. T'Pol's journey is marked by her struggle to balance the logic and emotional control valued by her people with the more impulsive, passionate nature of humanity. Her interactions with her human crewmates, especially with Captain Archer and Commander Charles Trip Tucker, highlight her personal growth. This version of T'Pol deals with numerous personal and professional challenges, including an addiction to Trillium-D, a substance that destabilizes her emotions. She also faces the difficulties of being the first Vulcan to serve aboard a primarily human crew, which results in conflicts with both the humans and her fellow Vulcans. T'Pol's development from a rigid, dispassionate Vulcan to a more open, emotionally complex individual is one of the primary arcs of the series. 2. The future T'Pol in E2. In the episode E2, short for E squared, the crew of the NX-01 encounters an alternate version of their own ship, which has been displaced 117 years into the past. On this ship, a future version of T'Pol exists, having lived far longer than she would have in the standard timeline. She is more somber and reserved, carrying the weight of her ship's long and difficult journey through time. This version of T'Pol is a reflection of the potential consequences of the crew's mission and the sacrifices they might have to make in the future. She marries Trip Tucker in this timeline, and the two of them have a son, creating an unexpected familial connection between them that contrasts with their complicated relationship in the main timeline. This alternate future also shows T'Pol as a leader who has grown even more attuned to human emotions and values, while still retaining her Vulcan discipline. 3. The Mirror Universe T'Pol. One of the most iconic alternate versions of T'Pol appears in the Mirror Universe, a parallel dimension introduced in Star Trek, the original series, and revisited in Enterprise. In the two-part episode In a Mirror Darkly, we see a very different T'Pol who exists in this brutal, totalitarian version of the universe. In this reality, T'Pol serves aboard the Terran Empire's starship SS Enterprise under the ruthless command of Captain Forrest, later taken over by Archer. Unlike her Prime Universe counterpart, this T'Pol operates within a culture that glorifies violence, treachery, and domination. However, her inner struggle is evident. This Mirror Universe, T'Pol is still more logical and restrained than her human crewmates, and she ultimately conspires to rebel against the Terran Empire's tyranny. Mirror T'Pol is both more vulnerable and more calculating, using her intellect to survive in a cutthroat environment. Her character in the Mirror Universe showcases how even in a twisted reality, T'Pol retains her Vulcan nature, albeit tempered by the harsher circumstances of her surroundings. 4. T'Pol in the Temporal Cold War. The Temporal Cold War is one of the most enigmatic plot lines in Enterprise, with factions from different points in time influencing events in the 22nd century. T'Pol's involvement in the Temporal Cold War, though less direct than some of her crewmates, offers another version of her character that is defined by a broader understanding of time and its manipulation. In several episodes, T'Pol encounters information and events from the future that challenge her Vulcan belief in linear time. For instance, in Shockwave Part 2, T'Pol briefly witnesses the 31st century, causing her to question her views on time and logic. These experiences push T'Pol to confront not just temporal anomalies, but also the limitations of her Vulcan training, which traditionally dismisses such paradoxes as illogical. Though this version of T'Pol is still within the framework of the Prime timeline, her exposure to the Temporal Cold War gives her a unique perspective on events, making her more open to unconventional ideas and more accepting of uncertainty than other Vulcans might be. 5. The alternate history T'Pol in Twilight. In the episode Twilight, we see yet another alternate version of T'Pol, this time in a universe where Earth has been destroyed by the Xindi. In this version of events, T'Pol remains at Captain Archer's side for years after he is incapacitated by a neurological disorder that prevents him from forming new long-term memories. She sacrifices her career and much of her personal life to care for Archer, reflecting her deep sense of duty and her strong bond with him.